One other place that again comes to mind, and I was reminded of it as we were working on the new and the edit pages here. Something that happened as we were going through and working on the new and edit pages was that originally I used to have a longer field here for typing a color name, but at the beginning I had originally made the fields for red, green, and blue value short, so that they only held, I believe I set it to hold 3 characters, even though 2 is really all they need. I lost that though, and I ended up with all of my text fields on both my new and my edit page being longer. When that actually happened, when I lost those shorter fields, was when I switched over to using a for each loop on my new and my edit pages to actually display my forms. At the time, I think we had a very good reason for doing that, because otherwise putting in the actual highlighting of the fields in the case of validation errors was going to be a lot of work. So what we did was we switched over and started using a field names array, which itself was a pretty neat way of doing things. It let us dynamically create all these individual fields. Later we also incorporated some nice regular expression validation into that. But it doesn't allow me, as things work right now, to be able to do things like to specify different sizes for my different fields, or any other attributes for that matter. For example, if I wanted to be able to say that I want the color name field to be of a particular width and I wanted red, green, and blue to be of a different width, how could I even do that with field names? Well, at this point, what I'd have to do, already assigning a key and a value for each one of those different fields, I would pretty much have to take the value where the regular expression is now and turn that into a subarray. So my field names array would become a 2-dimensional array, something like my colors array has been now for a while. Inside that subarray, what I could do is I could put in the regular expression used for validating a field, and I could also in that array put in other attributes for that particular field. How big I want it to be, what error message I want it to display, different things of that nature. But now I'm starting to think, well, maybe we could accomplish the same basic goal that we had originally set out to, which was to have this nice highlighting of fields with validation errors. I'm thinking maybe we can still have that, but maybe we could do this without that field names array at all. What if I simply created a function? Instead of having a for each loop to go through and create the 4 fields for me based on the data in an array, what if I had a function I could call? I would have to call it 4 times because I have 4 fields, but that's just 4 lines of code. 4 function calls shouldn't be that big of a deal. And for that function, I could set it up so that I could pass it potentially any data that I want to pass it. That could be a pretty useful thing. For this imaginary text field function that I haven't actually created yet, I don't know that I would want to put it in my colors library file. Since this field function, this text field function, is not specifically tied to colors, but is potentially something that I could use to generate form code anywhere, I think I might actually like to make a different file that I could then require that would have that function in it. So here I've started a new file. I'm going to call it forms_lib, forms_lib, and I've again stored it over in my library directory. In this file, what I'm thinking I could do is any functions that I wanted to create that have to do specifically with form elements, I could put those into this particular file and then require them whenever those capabilities are necessary. What I'm thinking here is maybe a function called textField. Not positive quite yet what I might want to pass to it, but that would be the basic idea, is a function called textField. Over on my new page then, back up at the top, I'm going to add in a new require for my forms_lib file. And then what I'm hoping that will let me then do is down in the actual form itself, I could, instead of doing all that work that I had in there before, I could instead do something along the lines of saying text field for, let's say, color name. And that's how I would create the text field for color name. And then essentially all of this other work that I have down here that it takes to actually put a form together, a field together, I could move all that over into that function. Let's give that a try. I'm going to go ahead and take all the rest of this code that I'm writing right here. I'm going to chop it out of my form. I'm going to get rid of that for each loop that I've been leaning on. Let me go back over to my forms library now, and into that function called textField, let me drop in that code. For starters, let me just clean that code up a little bit, get rid of all these PHP tags that I copied out of it. I'm going to label the end of this function just to help me keep track of where things are. Let me get rid of the alternate syntax that I was using, get back to just good old regular curly braces there, and let's see what we have at that point. This function is going to lean a lot, is going to need the actual name of the field that's being used. So let me tell this function it's going to receive a name variable. So like on my new page, when I called the function and I passed it color name will become the value of the name variable that's being passed to the function here. So that name variable is going to be used. We're going to split it up into the name parts. We're then going to recombine it back together into the nice name with the uppercased words. That'll be used to make my label. I'm going to check my errors array then to see if there is a element in that array that has that name. That brings up a bit of an issue. Apparently this function is going to have need of my errors array so it can detect if there's an error with the field or not. So let me say this function, in addition to the name, is also going to be passed the errors array. Back over on my new page then, I'll actually pass that errors array. Back in the function again then, if there is an error, what we want to do is put out a paragraph that looks something like this. Here I'm fully in PHP mode, so let me take and turn that into an echo. I'll go ahead and turn the paragraph tag that's output, if there is no error, into an echo as well. What I then have left down here, it looks like, is a mix of some PHP and some regular HTML. Whether you wanted to write this as PHP or HTML is really kind of up to you. Here in this function, I feel very much like I want to be in PHP mode, so I'm going to go ahead and keep writing things sort of in a PHP style, which basically means taking these lines and turning them into echoes as well. So here with my label, let me say echo 4. I'll put that inside quotes, and then I'll append to that the name that was passed to this function. And then I'll append to that closing quote and the closing angle bracket. To that I will then append the nice name, and then after the nice name, I'll append in the closing label tag. If that lost you a little bit, I certainly don't blame you. Working your way in and out of all those different quotes, the combining side by side of the HTML and the PHP is never an easy thing. I think eventually you kind of get used to working with the quotes that way, but it's never super easy. I'm always very careful when I do it. Let's go the process again here with my input tag. I want to turn the whole thing into an echo. So all of the static parts, I basically turn into PHP strings, and then the parts of the PHP that were being echoed before, I append those. So I'll append to that value of the name variable. I'll append to that then the ID attribute, and then from that the actual name itself, and then the closing of the tag there. So I've got my input tag, type text, the name attribute. Inside a set of quotes will have the actual name of the field. The value attribute inside a set of quotes will have the actual value of the attribute. The ID for the tag will have in it again the name attribute. So let's see if it works. Over on the new page, I do believe I already have the function set up to be called for the color name array, or I'm sorry, the color name variable. Let's see if that field is generated on my new page. Back in the browser, new page, I'm going to hit refresh, and it looks like it died a little bit. It's telling me I have an undefined variable color name. The error in this case, unlike pretty much every error we've seen before, is not coming from the file that's being accessed. Here I'm accessing my new page, but the error itself isn't on the new page. It's actually on line 14 of my forms library file. This is at this point when we start mixing code from multiple pages by using require, is when we especially want to start paying attention to where the error actually exists, not just the line number. So let me go back over to my forms library file, line 14, and see if we can figure out why it doesn't like my color name variable. So here's the forms lib file, line 14. The color name variable I'm pretty sure is this right here, the $$ name that it's specifying. Ah, here we go. I think I see what the problem is. Running back through it again here. In the browser I'm getting this error saying that I have an undefined variable called color name. That's on line 14. That error is actually showing up here on line 14 of my form.libs file. Line 14 is here where I'm trying to access my variable. My variable is using the name variable, which was passed to this function, in order to construct another variable, which it's then trying to access the value of. The value of the name variable is color name, so it's the color name variable that's being constructed and we're trying to access the value of. The color name variable is in existence. It exists here in my new page, which is where my form function is being called from. The problem is scope. I've been bitten by function scope. Even though I do have a variable of the proper name, that variable exists in the page scope and because of that, it is inaccessible in the function scope. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to find a way to pass the value, not rely on the function to be able to access the value on its own. If I jump back down to my form where the text field function is actually being called from, what I could potentially do is I could pass the actual value right here that I'm wanting to pass into that function. So if it's the color name variable's value that's needed in the function, I'll pass that value. And then over in the function, I'll provide a variable that I can use to receive and store that value. Even though value is a bit of a generic name for a variable, I'm going to go ahead and use it because what I'm literally referring to here is the value that's supposed to go into the field. With that value variable, I can then put that in place here of my variable, and if I go give that another try in the browser now, the error goes away and it looks like it's working okay. So my form is showing up. If I try submitting the form, I guess, with no value, I'm not seeing my validation work, but my form is pretty far from complete at this point. So maybe I should try filling out a few more fields and see what actually happens here. Back over in my new page, let me go ahead and add text fields for some of the other parts of my form. I'm going to copy and paste in some text fields. Besides the text field for color name, I'm also going to want the text fields for red value, green value, and blue value. And I'm going to want to access the proper values to get their variables. So $red value for the red value, and the same for green and blue. There they are. Let's see how my form looks with those 4 function calls. There's the way it's actually showing up right now. If I try to actually submit, it looks like validation's working okay now. Validation wasn't working before when I only had the color name field because it wasn't detecting that I had a full request that was being submitted, so it wasn't even bothering to validate it. But now it looks like things are getting a little bit closer. Validation looks like it's working again. And it looks like I can actually create a color. So things look like they're going pretty well with my new text field function. Now that I have that text field function, I'm no longer relying on a loop to put those together. I could actually potentially do a little bit more customization with each of my individual fields. I could, for example, maybe set it up to where I could specify a size for each one of the individual fields. So maybe for the text fields for my 3 color parts, I could specify I want a field size of 3. Maybe I should do 2, since technically I'm only allowing 2 characters. I don't really want to specify a size at all for the color name, so I'm just going to leave that out and maybe we can take care of that with a default argument. Back over in my formlibs file, in my text field function, I could add a 4th parameter, 4th value that's being passed to the function here. I'll just call it size, and maybe I'll give it a default value, let's just say of 0. When I'm actually coming down and putting my field together then, I could work that size value in at some point when I'm actually constructing the field. Maybe what I'll do is I'll take the building of the field and I'll break it up over multiple lines. I could have an echo here that starts off the text field, type text, and then maybe I'll take the line part or the name part, turn that into a separate echo. Then I just have to be careful to keep my quotes straight. I lost a quote on one line and I added one on another, so there we go. Let me do the same thing then for the value. There we are. And let me split off the ID. Overall, this line's gotten quite a bit longer than it was before, but it might make it a little bit easier to update if I have it broken up into these separate pieces. I think I see one little place here where I'd rather have a double quote there instead of over here in front of value. Same thing here, just to help it all make a little bit more sense. There, I think that's probably pretty okay. Now what I could maybe do to take care of that size is I think maybe I'll throw an if statement in here, and I'll say if the value of the size variable, if it's greater than 0, so if anything other than 0 has been specified, then maybe I'll go ahead and echo in there size equals, and then I'll append to that the value of the size variable. I think that should do the trick. So we'll get a size dropped in if a size is specified, but if size is 0, we just won't even bother. Let me jump over to the browser now and see how that looks. I refresh, and now my color fields are back down to being short, just big enough for the values that are being put in them. And my color name field has stayed nice and big, I guess. If I take a look at the code that's being generated, everything's a little bit run together down in the actual form itself. I could print out some new lines if I wanted to kind of clean that up. But looking at the size part, it looks like I might need a space in there in front of the ID. Actually, a space around quite a few of those components might break it up and make it just a little bit more readable, but I think effectively that's getting the job done. If I was going to throw those spaces in, it might be easiest to just throw them in before each of these different parts. There we are. In the browser one more time, take a gander at the code, and that's the way it looks. One of my text fields, input type text, name green value, value equals nothing, size equals 2, ID equals green value. Looks pretty all right to me. So I think that takes care of our text field function. That now gives us a nice new way to be able to display our form. Instead of using a loop, we can just call this function 4 times. I think overall, this actually ended up, at least in the new page itself, being actually less code than what I had before. And I definitely think it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read, and it now offers me the possibility of being able to customize fields on a field-by-field basis, which was something that was getting to be a little bit of a challenge when I was doing this with the loop. Now that I've switched over to using this text field function for the form itself, that means I no longer need the field name function that I put in up here, or at least I don't for the form. I am actually still using that same array here when I'm doing my actual validation. Well, I wonder if maybe validation might not be improved by making a function to do it that I could simply call for each of my fields instead of going through and doing it with a loop instead. What I'm thinking is something like calling a validate function. And I suppose I would need to pass it the value that's being validated. So for example, I might pass it color name. I would also need to give it the regular expression that's used to validate it. So I'm thinking about something like A through Z lowercase, A through Z uppercase, 0 through 9, essentially the same regular expression that I was using up in my array that I'd been using I guess I still am using technically, in the loop there. One of the things that might potentially be an advantage by using the validate function, or a validate function, I'm just making this up right now, I haven't written the thing yet, but one potential advantage might be that we'll be able to customize it a bit more, kind of like with the text fields. For example, I've been a little bit unhappy with the fact that I was having to give these very generic error messages. I like that we're able to put the name of the field in it with nice name, but just saying that every field does not appear valid is not particularly helpful to the user. It might be better if I was able to give them something more specific, like the color component is supposed to be a hexadecimal number, or the color name cannot be blank. So what if I was to also pass the errors array here? We're definitely going to need to have access to our errors, and maybe I could also then optionally, or even required, pass in an error message. So for color name, I could say the color name cannot be blank. So that's kind of a bit of a template of how I would like my validate function to look. Let me take my for each loop over here. I'm going to chop it out, cut it, and let me move that over to one of my library files as well. Let's see, should I put that one with form stuff or color stuff? I think validation is something that's kind of generally done with any type of form, so let me put that over in my form file. So a new function I'm going to create, I'm going to call it validate. I'm going to paste in the code that I copied from my new page, and then the validate function itself is going to be given the value that it's going to validate. It's going to be given the pattern that it uses to validate. It's going to be given an errors array, which is where it will store the message if there is a problem. And it will be given some kind of error message, which is what it'll put into the error array if the problem actually is found. So let's see, how would this work? I'm not going to need my for each loop, so that can go away. Since I'm handwriting a error message, I don't need to worry about generating the actual nice field name itself, so that can go away. What I could do here instead is I could just say if there's not a match using preg match between the pattern and here I would want to say the value that was passed, then what I would want to do is into the errors array, I would want to put in my message. The trouble here, I suppose, would be that when I go to put the message in, I want to put the message into the errors array based on the name of the field, and that is a piece of data I didn't actually pass. So I suppose this function is going to need access to the name of the field itself. Back in the new page, that should be easy enough to do. I'll just pass as a first parameter here the name of the field, color name in this particular case. My validate function will then have access to that so that we'll be able to use it to properly store the error message in the errors array. That function ended up being very short and very simple. I already spotted one error in it though, but we could go ahead and go take a look and see how it works. Back on the new page, let me copy my validate function and fill it in so that I am also validating the different color components. So I'll do a red value, a green value, and a blue value. I'm going to need to give it the matching variable names, red value, green value, and the blue value. And then give it the proper regular expressions to validate those color fields. There those are. And maybe some custom error messages to go along with each one of my color fields. For the red field, I'll say the red value must be a 2-digit hex value. I'll do essentially the same thing for the other two color fields then. I'll just change the name of the field for each one of them. So the green value must be a 2-digit hex value, and the blue value must be a 2-digit hex value. There we are. Let's give that a try and see how it works. Back on the new page, if I load everything up from scratch, if I submit my form, I ended up getting some errors here. Now that's not exactly what I was expecting. It redirected me back over to my show page, which is also kind of interesting. It's telling me in my color lib file on line 13, 14, 15, and 16 I have undefined offsets. Isn't that peculiar? Back over on the new page again, if I again try to refresh, seems okay now. If I submit the form, oh, there we are back again. Very peculiar. Let me go back to the home page here. Oh, look at this. We're getting some corrupted records into our file. Looks like things in our data file have gotten fairly messed up. That's probably because validation depends on the data in our file being correct. If we have no errors, then we write the data to the file. And the problem is here I actually do have errors, but apparently my new validation function is not catching them correctly. Well, why wouldn't it be catching them correctly? I can tell you I'm pretty sure the problem is right here with the errors array itself. What I'm doing is I'm passing the errors array over to my function. Over in my function I'm receiving the errors array, and then if I find a problem with the field, I make a change to that errors array, but I'm not returning it. I'm not actually giving the changed errors array back. So what I'm actually doing is changing a copy of the errors array, not the original array itself. I could go ahead and return the errors array. I'm not returning anything else. What I would need to do on my new page then is every time I call validate, I would need to assign the modified errors array back on top of the errors array that I already have. But even though I said I'm not a particularly large fan of doing this, I think what I might actually do instead is I'm going to set it up to pass a reference to the errors array. So whenever the errors array is passed, it's not a copy of the array itself, it is the variable, the errors array variable. So whenever my function here makes a change to that variable, it'll be the same errors array out here in the new page. So there's no need at that point to actually return anything. Let me go clean up my data file and let's give this another try now. I'm back over in my browser now, having cleaned up my data file. I wiped out some of those test colors we put at the end, plus the extra blank records that I was being allowed to write because my validation was broken. Now that I'm back here, let's go give new a try again. If I come to my new page and I again try to create a blank record, now it's back to working the way that it actually should. Let's just make sure that everything looks like it's still working okay. Everything looks pretty good so far. I'll go ahead and finish it off by putting in a valid name. And there we go. We created a lovely mustard type color. I'll have to go back and rename that one with my edit component. But that seems to be working all right. So what we've been able to do is through the use of functions, we've been able to actually remove and refine a lot of the code that we have here in our examples. Our index page, the PHP code up at the top, has become almost nothing at this point, and we've been able to trim off quite a bit from quite a few of our other files. Most of the other files still have some more code in them. The index page is certainly the shortest, but our show page has gotten considerably shorter. Our new and our edit pages have gotten considerably shorter too, and we've kind of changed the style of the way we were handling a couple things there. We've changed over to using text fields, a text field function to generate the fields in our form, and we've switched over to using a validate function to actually validate those fields. Both of those in place of the field names array, which is up here, which I could now get rid of. I need to make about all these same changes back over in my edit page. Change my edit form so that it uses my new text field function. There it is. But I might leave that for another video because here before too much longer I suspect that the new form and the edit form will probably become one since they are basically identical anyway. but I will need to go ahead and shift over to the new way of doing my validation over on my edit page. Here it is right here. So get that caught up with the way that I'm doing it on the new page. With all those changes made, I would say it's overall definitely a benefit to the way we were doing things before. And we have some good reusable functions. So especially some of the ones having to do with working with the form are certainly things that could potentially come in handy to us over and over again as we go on to other projects in the future.